Good evening. I'm very glad to be back. And for those of you that are here, I'm glad that you were able to make it because I know it's quite cold and the roads are icy. But as you may know already, we've made a plan where we're going to cover the whole book of Daniel in the span of 12 months. And so each month we're going to be covering a different topic. We know that Brother Peter, he's covering one topic, Brother Septimio, he's covering another one, and so I will be covering the book of Daniel. And so each month we're going to be looking at one chapter. We're going to be going chapter by chapter through the whole book of Daniel. And one of the reasons why I really enjoy when we pick a book is that oftentimes when we go through the books of the Bible, it's a little easier for us to kind of pick a topic and kind of get different verses and go with the topic. But when we go with a book of the Bible and we go verse by verse, you're often forced, in a way, to look at verses that you wouldn't otherwise consider, right? And some details that are often lost when we're looking at a thematic study. And so now we're going to be going chapter by chapter. And incidentally, the book of Daniel has, very conveniently, it has 12 chapters. And so we're going to do one chapter per month. And so we're going to get right into it, and we're going to start with the first verse, and we're going to get a little bit of back history before we start getting into some of the verses here. Now, one of the things that were very common with the ancient governments was that when they were conquering other kingdoms, they all shared the same practices. And as we go through chapter 1, I want you to keep in mind this verse. When we go to Revelation, we are called to come out of Babylon. And so as we go through chapter 1, keep in mind this revelation when God says, come out of Babylon, and also when we read in Corinthians, come out of her, do not touch the unclean. And so this theme is going to keep coming up throughout chapter 1. Now, there's a very famous painting that I would like to share with you, and this one was done by Gebhard Fugel. And so this is the depiction of the Jews in Babylon, and the title of this painting is called By the Rivers of Babylon. And so we're going to look at Psalms, and Psalms actually depicts what this picture is trying to convey. And so one of the things that all of the governments that were conquering other nations had in common was that one of the tactics that they used in order to bring into subjection the kingdoms that they conquered was, of course, they burnt their cities to the ground. And the other one was that they tried to disperse them through different parts of their kingdom. And the whole point was that imagine that China comes and conquers the U.S. And so China comes and they grab the Americans, and so they go ahead and put the Americans in Mexico, grab another country that they conquered and put it into the U.S. And this was one of the tactics that they would use. And the whole purpose of this tactic was to make sure that they would forget their culture. And so what happens, and we're going to look at some of the things that happen when you're moved to another place forcibly. And so let's go to Psalms, and this is what this picture is trying to depict. Psalms 137, verse 1, it says, "By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down. Yea, we wept when we remembered Zion." Then in verse 2, it says, "We hung our harps upon the willows in the midst of it." And then it says, "For there those who carried us away captive asked of us a song." So here, the Jewish people, they're captive in Babylon. And so now the people that have captivated them, they're asking them, go ahead and sing a song. "And those who plundered us requested mirth, saying, sing us one of the songs of Zion." So what do you think was Israel's response, or the Jewish response to the Babylonians asking them, go ahead and sing us one of those songs that you used to sing back in the day when you were free? And then look what's their response. It says, "How shall we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land?" And then this is a very, very famous, I'm sure all of you have read this verse here. It says, "If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget its skill. If I do not remember you, let my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth. If I do not exalt Jerusalem above my chief joy." And so this was, Israel's sentiment when they were taken to Babylon. And so the last thing that they wanted to do was to remember, the things that they have lost. And so now the Babylonians were a little bit mocking them and telling them, go ahead and sing us that song they used to sing when you were free. But now we're going to look at another aspect of this exile to Babylon. And this is going to be a little controversial. And so we're going to look at the earliest historical mass deportations when it came to Babylon. And so as we talked about in the beginning, this was one of the tactics that they would use in order to make sure that their history and their culture was forever forgotten. And the best way to do it was to send them to different parts of the country. And so they would forget about it. And so now we have here, this is called the Lachish Reliefs. And as you can see here, I'm not sure if you're able to see from the screen, but this is basically when Babylon came and captivated the people, they would grab them. So let's suppose that they came to Jerusalem. They captured everybody that they had in Jerusalem, took them to another place that they had also captured, and then they would bring those people from that other government that they had captured and bring them to Jerusalem. And so they would swap communities, and so they would force them out. And so here we have a description of the Babylonians, and as you can see, they're carrying their stuff and they're forced to leave their home country. And this is part of a huge wall that they actually have. And it says here, you can see the survivors fleeing the burning city. And if people were not willing to leave, they would burn the city and actually force them to go to the place that they wanted them to go. And so this was one of the strategies that they would use in order to make sure that they would forget their culture. So now we're going to look at a little bit of a psychological aspect of what that actually does to us when you're forced to go into another country. It's a very different thing. If you decide to go to a country and make a living there, it's different when you're actually forced to move into a place that you don't want to go. And so these are two psychiatrists, and this is what they say happens when you are forced to go into a country that is not your own. It says individuals who migrate experience multiple stresses that can impact their mental well-being. And then it says, including the loss of cultural norms. And so think about the norms and the culture of the Jewish people at that time. And then it says also religious customs. And so this is what it does. Then it says in social support system, adjustment to a new culture, and changes in identity. We're going to look a little bit on that later on. And concept of self. Indeed, the rates of mental illness are increased in some migrant groups. And so as a result, when we look at the history of the Jewish people, once they were removed from Jerusalem, did you know that one of their response in order to keep their culture alive and to keep their religion alive was the creation of the Pharisees? And so the Pharisees were actually there to make sure that they would never forget their culture and to never forget their religion. And so when we look at the Pharisees in the New Testament, oftentimes we think about the Pharisees as being very strict and being very imposing, very legalistic. And so when we look at the history on how they came about, you can understand why they were very passionate in their, according to their own ideas, to make sure that their religion was kept alive. And so this is what you do when you're taken to a place that you don't want to go. You do the best that you can to make sure that you don't lose that faith. And of course, obviously, we know that the Pharisees began to create different, traditions, different rules in order to make sure that this religion was kept alive. So now let's go into some of the verses. And so oftentimes we hear about, this famous saying, when in Rome, we are told, do as the Romans. But God's plan for his people was not this. They were supposed to be unique. And so now we're going to go to Daniel chapter 1, and we're going to start with verse 4. And it says, children. And so one of the first things that Babylon does in order to make sure that the people were assimilated was they selected the best of the best of the best. And so everybody else, of course, unfortunately, they had a very hard time, but they would select the best of the best, preferably nobility, because they knew that they had the best education. And so what does Nebuchadnezzar actually do? He selects children in whom was no blemish. It says that they were well favored. This is, when we go to the original Hebrew here, well favored is another word for they were actually good looking, right? They didn't want people that were ugly. They would look for people that were very well good looking. They had to be skillful. And then it also adds they were very wise. They were cunning in knowledge. They were understanding in the sciences. And then it says, and such as had ability in them to stand in the king's palace. And so they would select a very special kind of people, and this was their way of making sure that everybody was going to adapt to this new culture. But before I go to the next verse, I would like us to go very briefly to the previous verse, and I don't have it here. As I was driving here, I was thinking about the first verse, and it got me thinking. So let's go to verse 2 before we go on. So you can open your Bibles in Daniel chapter 1 and verse 2. And then it says, and the Lord God gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with part of the vessels of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar to the house of his God, and he brought the vessels in the treasure house of his God. What does Babylon do when Babylon conquers? And this was very significant. If we remember some of the stories in the Old Testament, what happened when Israel was conquered? What happened to the Ark of the Covenant? Back in the day when Israel was conquered, where did that ark end up in? Who remembers? The ark ended up in one of their very famous temples. And so when we look at archaeology and also how the other governments and the kingdoms at that time functioned, this was a way of them saying, our God has now conquered your God. So they have taken their people, right? They take the people captive, but also they take their religious articles and they go ahead and put it in the temple of their own God. And it was a way of saying, you know what? Our God is stronger than your God. Now your stuff is going to be in our temple. Anyway, so going to the next verse here in Daniel 4. So they chose the very best of the best. Then in verse 4, and whom they might teach the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans. What is another way that Babylon uses in order to assimilate its captives into their own culture? We look at the fact that they choose the best of the best. And then the very next point is, what do? Babylon will focus on your education. And so one of the things that I would like us to keep in mind later on, once we go to the other chapters, when we look at the prophecy, Babylon is going to always have this characteristic. They will focus a lot on your education. And in a way, that's something nice. You know, if somebody conquers you and they choose you and they put you in the best schools, they give you the best food, as we're going to look at later on, how do you actually feel when somebody does that for you? It's nice. If they give you education, then you feel very nice. And so this was one of their tactics in order to convert them to their religion as well. So now let's go to verse 5. What is the very next thing that Babylon uses in order to assimilate its captives? In verse 5 it says, and the king appointed them a daily provision of the king's meat and of the wine which he drank, so nourishing them 3 years, that at the end thereof they might stand before the king. So this was a very, very rigorous process. What was the king planning to do? It wasn't just a one-weekend thing. He was planning to feed them for a span of 3 years with the best food that there was available, the king's food. And so for 3 years, this was his plan. And now let's move on to verse 7. And then it says, unto whom the prince of the eunuchs gave names. And so this will be the other phase in which Babylon will try to convert people to its customs. And the other one was they were going to give them new names. It says, for he gave unto Daniel the name of Belshazzar, and to Hananiah, Shadrach, and to Mishael of Meshach, and to Azariah of Abednego. So there are a couple of dimensions here. When somebody gives you a new name, what do you think it's a sign of? And so now I would like to, we've all listened to the news, and whether you agree with it or not, Trump has done something very interesting. And what has he done? He has renamed the Gulf of Mexico. What do you think that actually means? I mean, we're talking about governments and whether you like the change or not. What do you think, what kind of move do you think it is when a government decides to rename, not you, but rename a piece of land? What do you think that is? What kind of move do you think it is? It's their land. It's actually a power move. And so when the king here of Babylon decides that he's going to rename not Jerusalem, he's going to rename its captives, it's a power move. He's actually trying to make sure that he's changing their identity. And remember, by this time, there's a lot of things that has changed. He has taken them out of their country. For the rest of the Jews, they have been scattered throughout the kingdom in order to assimilate to this new culture. He has also trying to give them very specific food for them, and now he's going to give them new names. And by the way, these new names have different things in them, and most specifically, they have the names of their gods, as opposed to their Jewish names, which had the names of God. And so this is what they decide to do. And so now let's look at what does Daniel and his friends decide to do. So Daniel chapter 8, it says here, but Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with a portion of the king's delicacies, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore, he requested of the chief of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. And so one of the key words that I see here in Daniel chapter 8 is that Daniel decides to do what? He purposes himself that he's not going to defile himself with the king's meat. And so this word purpose is very, very, very powerful in the Hebrew, because this is not, he decides or he chooses or he's hoping that he's going to not defile himself with the king's meat. He has made a decision, and in the Hebrew, this word is like, it's either death or life. There's no in between. And so this is what he decides. And so we see that true integrity is not formed in crisis, but is actually revealed in it. And so obviously Daniel's experience had been for many years. And so now when he comes to the test, he goes through the test and he has already made this choice beforehand. And now when we go to Luke 16 verse 10, we understand that when we are faithful in the small things, we will also be faithful in the things that are bigger. And actually, Ellen White also talks about it. It says, if we are consistent in little things, we shall be able to be consistent in larger matters. Now, I would like us to go to Revelation just briefly. I know we're in the book of Daniel, but Revelation actually echoes what Daniel mentions and what he actually purposes to do. So we're going to look at Revelation and 2 Corinthians. And so Revelation 18:4, it says, and I heard another voice from heaven saying, come out of her, my people, that ye be not partakers of her sins, and that ye receive not her plagues. And so what is the call here? Come out from her, my people, and do not partake of her sins. And in 2 Corinthians 6:17, again, it says, come out of among them, and be ye separate, says the Lord, and do not touch what is unclean. And so Daniel decides that he's not going to touch anything that's unclean, and he makes that decision. Now, what do you think will happen? How would you feel? Let's say that you're in a relationship, and what would you feel if you go to your let's say you have a crush on someone, and so you approach them, and you invite them out to dinner. And the girl says, or the guy says, thank you, but no thanks. What do you think would be the reaction? What is the message that you would be receiving? Somebody invites you out to dinner, and you invite somebody to dinner, and this person says, no, thank you. What is the message that you would be getting? Definitely not interested, doesn't want to build any relationship with me. This would be the kind of message that we would get. Now, going to Daniel's case, it wasn't a romantic relationship, but obviously the king was trying to establish some sort of connection with these men because, again, these men, Daniel and his friends, would stand in his palace. And so he wanted to make a relationship with them by giving them of their food. And so obviously now this becomes a test. And then in verse 9 from chapter 1, it says, and the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who has appointed your food and drink, for why should he see your faces looking worse than the young men who are your age? Then you would endanger my head before the king. Later on, as we go through the other chapters, we're going to see that King Nebuchadnezzar, he had quite the character. And so, obviously, if he had invested time in making sure that these men, Daniel and his friends, would eat of his food, if they didn't do that, who would be in danger now? This eunuch knows that his head would be endangered if they don't do that. And so when we go to verse 12, what is Daniel's proposal? It says, please test your servants for 10 days and let them give us vegetables to eat and water to drink. One of the things that I find very, very interesting here is if we go back to the previous verses, what was the span of time that the king had allocated for Daniel and his friends for them to eat his food? It was going to be 3 years. According to Nebuchadnezzar, 3 years would be enough for them to be in shape and to consume his food. But how much time does God actually need? Far less. 10 days, that's it. And so it says, please test your servants for 10 days, verses 3 years. Let them give us vegetables to eat and water to drink. And so when we go to verse 15, we see the result. And it says, at the end of the 10 days, their features appear better and fatter in flesh than all the young men who ate the portion of the king's delicacies. Then in verse 17, as for these 4 young men, God gave them knowledge and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. Then it continues to say, at the end, the king does something, and he says, then the king interviewed them, and among them all, none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore, they served before the king. And so one of the things that I want to bring out was that this was the basis for Daniel also to understand the visions and the prophecies that we'll see later on. Then in verse 19, it says, on all matters of wisdom and understanding, about which the king examined, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers who were in all his realm. And so here we see that God blesses those that actually remain true to him, despite the difficulties that they might encounter. And now I would like us to look at what is the appeal that we get from Daniel chapter 1. When we go to Matthew 6:24, it tells us that no one can serve 2 masters. For either, it says, they will hate one, or they will love the other, or else he will be loyal to one and despise the other. And also when we go to Luke 16 and verse 10, as we read before, he who is faithful in that which is least is faithful also in much, and he who is unjust in that which is least is also unjust in much. And so one of the things that we look at, Babylon is always a type of the world. And so the world will always be offering us education, the world will be offering us food. The world will be offering us anything that might appear to be good for us. But when we look at the story of Daniel, we see that he was faithful in the least of the things. I mean, sometimes we can look at it and see, it was just a meal. Perhaps if we were in their shoes, we would try to compromise as much as we can in order to make the king happy, because after all, they were already captives. But yet, Daniel and his friends decided to be faithful in the very least. And so my invitation for us today is to be like Daniel and to remember the little details when it comes to obeying God. And if we do, we're going to have the same experience that Daniel had. God will bless us, and he will bless us even greatly. And as we continue to go through the next months, going through the prophecies, these themes are going to be very, very important, because I believe that if we understand the highlight themes here in the first and the second chapter, it's actually going to help us understand the main themes when it comes to looking at the great controversy and what we're going to be going through at the end of time. So may the Lord help us. And so next month we're going to be going into Daniel chapter 2. Amen.